oil business in Iran. Today, he addressed top oil executives at the World Economic Forum in Davos. Iran has started implementing a key nuclear deal with world powers, a step toward a broad settlement which could lead to the end of sanctions. President Rouhani wants Western oil companies to revive its giant aging oil fields and develop new ones once the sanctions are lifted. Well, Iran is the subject of today's Inside Look, and joining me now from Sweden is Iranian politics expert Rouzbeh Parsi. Thank you so much for joining us, Rouzbeh. What were your thoughts today when you heard President Rouhani's speech?
Well, he's basically trying to keep up momentum and increase it in terms of the outreach to the world, but also to make it more concrete in order to make sure that there are dividends back home.
Is it the speech that people in Davos were waiting to hear, do you think?
Well, I think there's always an element of people being disappointed because they expect someone like Rouhani to move forward much faster. But I think that would be to underestimate the political hurdles he has to deal with at home.
Speaking today, President Rouhani says relations with Europe will be normalized. What does that mean exactly?
Well, what it could mean, what it should mean in the long term is, of course, that Iran will be back to a situation where it has normal relationships with most European countries in terms of trade, exchange, political discussions, and so on.
What will it take to get there?
Well, it will take, obviously, that the Iranians are focused in what they're trying to do in the outreach, but it will also entail that Europe and the European Union as such has a proper discussion among themselves about the strategy vis-a-vis Iran, what kind of relationship they want beyond the nuclear issue.
Speaking on the part of President Rouhani, would you say this gesture of opening up, for example, to the international oil companies today, is it a purely economical one or is it politically motivated as well?
It's both, absolutely. He was elected on the mandate of fixing the economy. And in order to do that, he needs to reach out to the world politically in order to facilitate bigger economic growth at home. And the oil industry, obviously, is a very important part of that.
Tell us a bit more about the oil industry and how crippling were the sanctions to the oil industry in Iran?
Well, we have to remember that the Iranian economy has been in a bad shape for a long time, which has to do with mismanagement at home and lack of investments in the industrial structure and infrastructure. So that is a given. What the sanctions have done is to exacerbate that. And what Iran needs, particularly on the oil side, is to upgrade its oil industry in terms of technology, not just finding new sources of oil, but also be more efficient in its production of the oil it has. And for that, they want to turn to Europe.
And so what does that require? Just more investment, promises of long-term investment? What exactly does Iran want?
What Iran wants is more investment. But they also want to be part of the technological development within the oil sector itself. It wants to develop its natural gas resources, which are huge, which requires, for instance, liquid natural gas technology, where Europe is on the forefront.
So what does this mean? Did the sanctions work?
No, they did not work in the simple sense that because we had sanctions, suddenly they're going to give us everything we want on the nuclear issue. No, it's not that simple. But what it did was to bring home to the politicians in Tehran the costs of continuing on a confrontational line. And so what they're trying to do is come back to what are the basics that they really, really want to stick to and what can they give away. And that is part of the negotiations.
Well, what do the hardliners in Iran think about this more moderate stance from President Rouhani? It does seem like it's light years away from Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, his predecessor.
It is in terms of the approach, and it is perhaps also in terms of the strategy. But I think when it comes to certain basic red lines of what they can live with and cannot live with, it's not necessarily that different from the previous administration. As far as the hardliners are concerned, there you have those who are skeptical that it could succeed and those who simply don't want it to succeed because they think it will compromise Iran's revolutionary heritage.
But if that's the case, then how do they propose to solve the economical problems that the country has?
Well, that's the point. They don't have any other solution, and that's also partly why they lost the election.
Well, these sanctions, of course, were linked to this nuclear deal that was put into place just a few months ago. We're now in this 6-month trial period that's already seen Iran live up to what seems to be its part of the bargain and scale back on that top level of uranium enrichment. What happens next? Will Iran follow through and lock in something more long-term?
I think Iran is definitely willing to do so. What remains now to be seen during these months is not only that every party, including us, live up to our end of the bargain, but also that they continue negotiating, keeping up momentum on what's supposed to be the final agreement, where they decide once and for all what Iran is allowed to do in terms of nuclear enrichment and how the rest of the world will then reward that.
What do you think the international community thinks? Can it trust Iran on the nuclear issue?
At this point, trust is irrelevant. That's the whole point of the interim agreement. It's supposed to help engender the trust necessary for a final agreement. So at this point, they don't have to trust each other. They just have to concretely see that each party is doing what they've promised to do. And if that happens, then you will have the trust necessary to sign a final agreement.
But concretely, do you think that Iran is still on the path to developing a nuclear weapon?
No, I think if you look at the intelligence estimates, most of them concur that that part of the program was probably scrapped or mothballed at least in 2003 already. So now it's more a question of making sure that the infrastructure that Iran has and the enrichment capacity that it has is under such a surveillance that if anyone in Iran was to entertain the idea to start it up again, we would find out in time.
Rouzbeh, also Iran has been in the news in regards to the current talks on Syria. At first it was invited by UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, then it was disinvited. Was that a mistake? Do you think Iran should have been at the table or should be at the table?
Absolutely. Iran should have been at the table 2 years ago. The problem, of course, with this kind of conflicts is that when your own side is winning, you are not willing to talk. So 2 years ago, when the rebels were winning, no one entertained the idea of having Iran at the table. Now Assad seems to be doing better, and now the Iranians are being a bit more difficult to get, and the Americans and everyone else don't really have a strategy, but they're insisting that Iran has to agree to preconditions. I think it was a mistake to disinvite them. To invite them was logical.
All right, thank you for that. Rouzbeh Parsi speaking to us there from Sweden. You are an Iranian politics expert. All right, well, the launch of the Six Nations